Hello, good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Philippe Zarka. Philippe is the Director de Recherche in l'ESIA, in l'Observatoire de Paris. He's also the Deputy Director of la Station de radioastronomie in Nancy. He has been studying the plasma interactions between stars and their planets, starting with the solar system and Jupiter and Saturn. He works with radio observations from the ground, but also with space mission. He has been very much involved in Cassini and now in Juno. He told me that one of his dreams is to detect the radio emission of a giant exoplanet. We'll see today if this dream will be fulfilled, maybe someday. And I wanted also to quote that Philippe is very much involved in outreach activities. He has written many books, a famous one about astrology, with Daniel Coot here.
Not very positive about it. But
well, you have to read it. He's also involved in science and art collaboration, and I encourage you to have a look at his web page on the l'ESIA site. So as I told, he's a radio astronomer, one of these astronomers that try to work, because it's a harsh environment, in the low frequency band. You know that it's a low, at low frequencies that radio astronomy started with Jansky. And you will see today that this wavelength range has changed a lot. And he has been the co-founder of the French LOFAR consortium. So we owe him the French participation in LOFAR. He is a core team member of one of the SCA science working group, SKA science working groups, the one about Cradle of Life. And he is also the PI of a very nice radio astronomy project called Nénuphar, which is currently built in Nancy and in the commissioning phase. So you will probably see very soon a call for proposal for Nénuphar. Today he's going to present us the results of the first new generation radio telescope, which is called LOFAR, and located in the Netherlands, and started its scientific observation, well, six years ago.
6 years.
And you are going to see the results of this telescope, which can be called an IT telescope. Thank you.
Merci Fabien. I have a microphone. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And so the talk, as you understand, is centered on the instrument LOFAR. So of course I will present scientific results from LOFAR, but they are very broad, and as you can imagine, I am not specialist of all the subjects I will deal with. So on some subjects, if there are some questions, I will point at some people in the room who are more expert than me for that. But I'll try to give a kind of panorama of the results, and to place LOFAR in the perspective of modern radio astronomy. And of course, for this talk, I had some slides about results from many people. Let me just cite one, Cyril Tass, who, as you will see, is central to the studies in imagery with LOFAR, especially on galactic and extragalactic fields. And there are a bunch of new results about that that are about to be published, and I have some slides about that. Okay. And of course, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to interrupt. So this is LOFAR. LOFAR is actually a European radio telescope. It is made, you know, of course, you remember all, I assume, a VLBI, where you connect antennas on different continents together to make a single instrument. It's approximately the same philosophy for LOFAR that is spread across Europe, so across about 2,000 kilometers in the maximum dimension, except that LOFAR is connected through the internet, high-rate internet, and so the observation that every site are digitized time-stamped and then sent to the central correlator that is in the north of Netherlands. And then this basically big computer combines the signals from all the antennas from LOFAR and synthesize a single telescope of 2,000 kilometer diameter. Of course, the effective area is just the sum of the effective area of everybody, which is quite big. So now, as you see, there are, well, you don't count it here, but I tell you there are about 50 operational LOFAR stations. So one antenna of LOFAR is called the station. I will detail what it means. So there are 51 operating, 38 in the Netherlands, that is the main country at the origin of LOFAR, and 13, as of today, international in the surrounding countries. And this number keeps on growing. For example, there is one in construction that will start operation in Latvia, here near Riga, in 2019. And the stations at international sites as twice as big as Dutch stations, which means that there is more or less a balance between Dutch and international effective area. Now, this is what it looks like. I will show you some more detail just after that. Near a LOFAR station typically is made of two fields of antenna, two antenna fields here, and some container that contains all the electronics, the backends, basically for the instrument. And one thing that we can say, is that LOFAR, as you can see here, it's very ugly, actually. You will see it. It's just very small, very low tiles covered of plastic, antennas made of simple wires above metal grids. So it's not impressive like the Effelberg or the Nancy radio telescope. But the number of antennas and their combination across Europe makes a quite formidable instrument. Actually, it is a multi-scale array. And this slide shows you both what it looks like and the range of frequency that it covers, represented in the transparency, in the actually opacity of the atmosphere that is represented as a function of the wavelengths here. You know that the atmosphere is in majority opaque or reflective to waves coming from outside, except in the visible and near infrared band, and in the radio window that is very broad, 4 orders of magnitude, from ALMA here to the right side, so the lowest frequency, the longest wavelengths, LOFAR in particular here, and NENUFAR. I will say a few words about that. So the basic Dutch station is an ensemble of antennas. So these tiles are actually styrofoam tiles covered of plastic that contain small dipole antennas. And you have other antennas here, and these antennas cover two different wavelength range. And they are separated here, these two, for purely technical reason in Netherlands. So in the north of Netherlands, you have the so-called SuperTerp, that is an ensemble of 6 stations close next to each other. That gives, I would say, the central sensitivity. Then in the 3 kilometers around, you have a total of 24 stations, and then 14 more in the Netherlands to total 38. And finally, you have the rest of the stations in the rest of Europe. And as far as antennas are concerned, you have approximately 1,800 antennas at the low frequency, 1,800 tiles, so groups of antennas. I will come back to this in 1 minute, at high frequencies, and 1,200 antennas in the international stations. So more than 3,000 antennas or tiles. So what do I mean with antennas and tiles? This is a close look to one typical international LOFAR station, the Nancy one. So this, you know, is the Nancy radio telescope that is now 60 years old and still very impressive. This is the very ugly LOFAR station that is nearby. And if we look it closely, it is indeed not so nice, because this is the so-called high band antennas that are, as I said, 5 by 5 meters styrofoam plates, including 16 dipole antennas in them and connected together. And at the low frequency here, you have antennas that you can hardly see on the picture. They are just the wires that come out from the mast. The mast is 1.6 meter height, and that go to the corners of the metal grid that is part of the antenna. It's a perfect mirror at these wavelengths, because we are here at wavelengths much longer than a few meters. And so the 15 centimeter size is very small compared to the wavelength, so it's a perfect mirror. So now, technically, what does it mean? Actually, LOFAR observes between 30 megahertz and 250 megahertz. It can observe down to 10 megahertz with reduced sensitivity. The antennas are not sensitive. So 30 to 250 megahertz, it's a broad range because it's almost a factor of 10 in frequency, but you cannot observe it at once for at least two reasons. One reason is that you cannot build efficient antennas that are efficient over one order of magnitude in wavelength or in frequency. And the second reason is even more obvious. In the middle of this frequency range, there is the FM band between 87 megahertz and 110 megahertz, so the FM radio band, that is completely saturated of artificial emission because we use it for the listening to the radio. So actually, for these two reasons, the instrument was cut in two, a part that observes below the FM band from 30 to 80 megahertz, and that is made of these single wire antennas over metal grids. There are 96 of them, and a part that observes above the FM band, so 110 to 250 megahertz, and that is made of these 96 tiles of 16 antennas each in the styrofoam plates. Okay. This is the size of each field. Every antenna, of course, has two polarization. Every dipole is actually a cross dipole, so two linear polarization at 90 degrees from each other that allow, by combination of them, to synthesize the full Stokes parameter, so the full polarization of the waves. And so you have 96 times 2. So 96 antennas times 2 receivers that are connected by cables from this to the central container that contain the electronics. And basically, the electronics digitize the signals of each antenna or each tile at each polarization, slices them in 200 kilohertz band, that is the unit of bandwidth that is used in LOFAR, and in each band combines the signals in phase in order to point the beam of the station to the desired direction. Alors, you know that when you have antennas, I will come back to that, you have basically two ways to use a field of antennas. Either you add the signals from all the antennas with adequate phase shift that allow the sum to be maximum in the desired direction. So you point a beam and you can observe at very high time and frequency resolution in this beam. Or you do the cross correlation of all antenna pairs 2 by 2. So if you have n antenna, n minus 1 divided by 2 pairs, and from the collection of these correlations, you can build the image. I will come back to this. So at the level of a station, we don't make images, we combine the antennas to form a beam, one or several beams in each 200 kilohertz band. You can make a beam and you can spread the beams as you want in the sky. And then these 200 kilohertz bands that are phased together and that are called beamlets, they are sent to the internet at a rate of 3 gigabits per second that allows 50 megahertz bandwidth to be sent at each time. They are sent to the central correlator, central computer, that is in the north of Netherlands, near Groningen. Normally, LOFAR operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So this data rate multiplied by 50, the number of stations, arrives permanently to the central correlator that processes the data and produces the image, the time frequency, dynamic spectra, and so on. And it is a cluster of GPU called Cobalt. Now, just one word. Of course, it's for beginners, but I will just spend 1 minute about antenna phasing and pointing. This is to compare how you steer an array of antenna, taking as an example a linear array. It's the same for a two-dimensional array on the ground, as compared to the mechanical radio telescope, the traditional parabola here. When you want to point a mechanical telescope, you move it to the source. It's long, it's heavy, it takes time. Here the time is accelerated. And with an array of antenna, it's different. Actually, each antenna is combined to a summator by cables. Only the two extreme cables are shown here, but all antennas are connected. Of course, if you connect the antennas with cable of all the same length here, the signals will be exactly in phase on the summator as it is in the antenna, and so the maximum response will be for the source that sends all signals in phase, so for a source that is at the zenith. And so you will have a plane wave hitting all the antennas at the same time that will give maximum response. If you have a source that is at a given angle from the zenith, this antenna receives the signal with some delay with respect to this one, for example, of course, a propagation delay. Now, if you compensate for this delay between the antenna and the receiver by some circuit, some cable length or electronic circuit that adds a delay that corresponds to this delay, you will maximize the response of the telescope, no more at the zenith, but in this direction. Of course, each antenna must be corrected for a delay that corresponds to the shift from this antenna. Of course, you can enter another delay to point at another direction, and because you can duplicate very easily the signal when it is digitized, you can even introduce both delays together, and so synthesize both beams in the sky at the same time. So you can make multi-beams by combining the signals. You are just limited by the 50 megahertz bandwidth total that you can transmit at a given time. And the advantage is that this way of pointing is extremely fast because it does not require any mechanical motion, only electronic connections, and so it can be very fast. So the way the LOFAR array works, nothing moves mechanically. So if nothing moves, how can you see different parts of the sky? The response is every single antenna is quasi-isotropic. So if you take an elementary antenna in LOFAR, it basically sees 2 pi, so one hemisphere above it. And so all the beams that will be combined, that will be formed by the combination of the signals, will be contained in the beam of this antenna, of course. And so it has to see all the sky if you want to be able to form beams in any direction. Now, at the level of one station, so locally in Nancy, in the UK, in one station in Netherlands, you combine the signals of every antenna field in order to form one or several broad beams. A station, as you have seen, is typically a few tens of meters across. So at the wavelengths we are working on, it corresponds to a beam that is typically 3 to 10 degrees across. So a very broad beam that is made at the station level. So one or several, as I said. And then all these signals, every beam in every bandwidth, is sent to the central computer in Groningen. And this central computer will further channelize the signal. In fine channels, you can go down to less than 1 kilohertz resolution, and then correlate the signal 2 by 2 and form images, or combine the signal to make very fine beams here. And now, because you are at the scale of several kilometers or several thousand kilometers, the pixel or the beam size will come down to arc minutes, arc seconds. And then you have the post-processing, that is the calibration and the scientific exploitation, and all the data is then put in a so-called long-term archive, which is one of the difficulties of LOFAR because the data are very voluminous. So actually, this is a slide that was given to me by Chiara Ferrari. It's really a software telescope. It's equivalent to a set of parabola, each station being equivalent to a parabola, but it is steerable by electronics. So there are typically 2 main and 1 secondary observation modes in LOFAR. One main observation mode is the so-called phased array, phased beam. So as I said, an antenna sees basically the whole sky. A station has a broad beam, and when you combine several stations together, you make a narrow beam that can go down to typically arc minutes here. And in this beam, you can get a very high time and frequency resolution and the polarization. And this mode, for example, is very useful to observe all sources that you cannot resolve in an angular way. For example, pulsars, typically. It's absolutely useless to make an image of pulsars because it will always be a point source. It is 20 kilometers at several tens of parsec. But you are very much interested in having a high time and frequency resolution because you want to observe the pulse, to observe the dispersion of the pulse in frequency, so you need this. So this is the mode for that. So a secondary mode is waveform capture, that it is snapshots, very short snapshots, a few seconds of waveform from all antennas that are used for special purpose. I will just say one word about it later. And the second main mode is actually interferometric imaging. So interferometric imaging, if Cyril Tass was here instead of me, for example, he could tell about it for more than 1 hour, and it would be very interesting. Let me be very brief. The magic of interferometric imaging is that there is a theorem that is called the theorem of Zernike-Van Sittert that tells you that when you compute cross-correlation of signals from a set of antennas on the ground, the ensemble, the group of these cross-correlations together, actually, are the Fourier transform of the image of the sky that you are interested in, multiplied by what is called the UV coverage, so the coverage of your telescope plane by the antennas. Or, in other terms, it's the Fourier transform of the image of the sky convolved by the PSFs of the instrument. And this tells you that the PSF, the point spread function of the instrument, is simply the Fourier transform of your UV coverage. So let's take a very simple example. If you have a single dish, your UV coverage in a single dish is just a dish. Okay? And the Fourier transform of a dish, it's an Airy function that is actually the PSF of a single dish. If you have a square telescope, it will be the product of two sine cardinal, and so on. Now, with a group of antennas, you have a UV coverage that is more rock and roll, I would say, than a dish. You have, for example, this is the VLA, the very large array in the New Mexico. You have antennas, parabolas that are distributed along a Y. And so when you compute all correlation from pairs of antennas, you can cover in the UV plane. The UV plane is just the baselines normalized to the wavelengths at which you work, but it's not a problem, the baseline here. And so you cover this kind of star with all the correlation from between two antennas. So you can see that it does not look like a dish. I mean, it's something, and the PSF is probably very disturbed. But you can use the Earth rotation in order to accumulate the measurements, and each point will become an ellipse in this plane. So you will go from this in a few hours to this. And this becomes much closer to a dish, and it has a kind of a nicer PSF. And when you have less antennas, for example, IRAM telescope, the coverage of the UV plane, is, even with Earth rotation, is quite sparse. So you have a radial and azimuthal coverage that is not perfect, but still you can work with it and make good antennas. And so this is really, so of course you can imagine that the UV coverage, the PSF, is so complicated that you will not take your data and simply make a Fourier transform of the visibilities to get the image. It has to be more complicated, and this is the art of interferometric imaging that I personally don't master. So in the case of LOFAR, of course, the Dutch core of LOFAR is quite dense. So the UV plane, so this is in kilo wavelengths. So it's length divided by the wavelengths. So the UV plane is densely covered at the scale of the Dutch LOFAR, and it's sparsely covered at the scale of the international stations that are spread across Europe and combined to everybody. But with Earth rotation, you still can reach quite a good coverage. So this is one difficulty of the observation in radio. Another big difficulty is the ionosphere. The ionosphere, it's a movie here. This is the scene that you are observing, and this is how it is in real time due to the ionosphere. The ionosphere plays the same role as the atmosphere in optics, but much worse. And the worse is when you go to the lowest frequency. The lower the frequency, the worse is the problem. And so radio astronomers working with LOFAR and even NENUFAR are kind of masochists, because they go to the frequency range where the sky is very bright because of the galactic background radiation, the interference environment is very harsh, and the ionosphere is very polluting. So why going there? Because there is science to do. Okay, so in summary, LOFAR is this. It's a European interferometer that is made of phased arrays. It contains this number of stations. It has this size. The effective area when you have antennas, it's not like a dish that is typically to an efficiency factor the size of the dish. It depends on the wavelengths. It's the cross section of the area with respect to the incoming radiation. So it's varying in lambda square. So actually a single area has a larger effective area at low frequency than at high frequency. So typically in the range of LOFAR, it's between 10 to the 4 and 10 to the 5 square meter. That is big. If you compare this to, for example, Arecibo telescope, it's larger. Arecibo telescope is just of the order of 10 to the 4 square meter. Frequency range, I already said this. Operating mode also. The resolution you can get depends if you use only the Dutch LOFAR or the international station. So you can get to some arc seconds to a fraction of an arc second. Of course, for people working with gravity, for example, in optics, this is very bad. But at this wavelength in radio, it's absolutely terrific. The sensitivity is quite good. Radio astronomers use not to work with watt per square meter per hertz because the numbers are too small. They use a unit that is a Jansky, as the founder of radio astronomy, that is 10 to the minus 26 watt per square meter per hertz. And typically, strong sources are about 1 Jansky. LOFAR can go to well below a millijansky in sensitivity, and it has to correct for all these problems I mentioned. It is really the first, because of its size and its sensitivity, it is the first all-purpose low-frequency spectroimager, and it was also the first of the SKA Pathfinder. I will say a word about SKA at the end, but you have to compare, when you compare LOFAR and SKA, it's comparing like a 2 chevaux Citroën, a kind of small car that you always open the engine and go into it to get the things out, and a Rolls-Royce. The 2 chevaux is actually made to have you become experimented in mechanics and in all this stuff, and this was the purpose of LOFAR, to work on the algorithm and all the kind of thing. So it's a very powerful but a complex instrument to use, and this may explain the fact that there are still a limited number of people in the French community, at least, using LOFAR. So a one-page history of LOFAR. The idea of the instrument really was born in the 2000 approximately. It was a US Netherlands instrument, but then they divorced in 2004 when the Dutch authorities provided most of the funding, imposing that the instrument would be located in the Netherlands. And then the American colleagues say, okay, we'll make separate instruments elsewhere. And this was the small LWA and the very nice MWA in Australia. So in France, there were a few people interested from the beginning, but there was a seminal workshop in 2006 of the French Long Wavelengths Consortium, and a school in Gutla in 2007, and finally, CNRS, Observatoire de Paris, and Université d'Orléans funded the LOFAR station that was installed and inaugurated in 2010. And it was during the start of the commissioning phase of LOFAR that took about 3 years, actually, because it was very complex to commission. And the scientific observation started on the 1st of December 2012. The first cycle, called cycle 0, actually, it was a cycle with unguaranteed quality observations, lasted for 11 months. And after that, the cycles of 6 months alternated, as for any radio telescope, from November to May and from May to November. And we are now in the, near the end of cycle 10, and the call for cycle 11 already went out and was closed. And there are basically calls in January and July every year. So from the beginning, the LOFAR science community was grouped in a so-called key science project. So these people interested in common scientific interest helped to define the characteristic of the telescope, because as it was a software telescope, it was very flexible, and so it has to be adapted to the scientific needs of the community. And so the survey, as they were defined at the time, now some of these surveys are more dissolved, I would say, and the people work with individual programs, I would say, or team programs, but some are very strong, like survey. Survey is really making a map of the universe for the first time at radio wavelengths and looking everything in this range. Studying magnetic field with Faraday effect, solar system, that is the topic in which we are most involved as PI, cosmic rays showers in the Earth's atmosphere, the transient sky, that is almost dissolved because it was very disappointing, as I would say. Very few transient was discovered in a blind way with LOFAR compared to what was expected. Pulsar is very successful, and epoch horizonization is making big progress, but did not detect the signal yet. I will come back to this in a few minutes. So typically, there are this amount of observing hours that are distributed every semester. The rest, if you take the number of hours in a semester that is above 4,000, is used for commissioning and maintenance and everything. And this is distributed in 30 to 40 programs, typically. So this is, for example, for cycle 7 and 8, cycle 7 typical programs. Typically, the French community is part of so first, the observation, of course, are organized with a granularity of 1 hour, so you can change targets every hour if needed. And typically, there are more than 200 people at international level, and the French participation is this one. So 8 to 10 core people deeply involved, 20 collaborators, postdoc, PhD students, typically 5% of the PI observation proposals, and COI is 10 to 50% with the main topics, surveys, planets, exoplanets, and also pulsar, magnetism, and so on. So now, okay, to observe, and I will finish my introduction. No, it was first part, actually, not the introduction. To observe, there is a website that describes very well the LOFAR Astronomers website. If you type LOFAR Astronomers in Google, you will go to this. That describes in detail the instrument, of course, and that directs you to the North Star proposal tool, as in many telescopes, in which you can propose every 6 months. And as I said, we are in cycle 10, and the next call will be in January for cycle 12, because cycle 11 is already programmed. Now, I will just make a brief panorama of some results. So I give, when I can, the authors of the paper corresponding. When there is no date, is that the paper are in preparation. When the authors are in red, is that it is a main French contribution. When it's in blue, it is that there are a contribution from French people, but not dominant. When it's in black, we don't contribute, typically. So one result that is not a big scientific result, but that I'm very proud of, is that actually the first fringes obtained between a LOFAR station and a distant radio telescope were obtained in 2007, so very, very early in the commissioning, between the first LOFAR station and the Nancy decameter array, an old instrument in Nancy, which observed Jupiter in time frequency, so very brief Jupiter emission that were intense and easy to locate in the time frequency plane. And this is, of course, Nancy decameter array observed in circular polarization, LOFAR in linear polarization. We have to combine this. But when we correlated the signals, we got very good correlations down to 22 megahertz, actually. And for example, the correlation map nicely reproduces the burst that we observe. And so we could demonstrate that at 700 kilometers distance, there was no problem in having correlation at 22 megahertz. Okay, we published a paper on that, and that was it, but it was nice. Now, just to get rid of it, it's very nice, but it's, as I told you, the observation mode of LOFAR that take waveform snapshots. So very brief, a few second snapshots at 5 nanosecond resolution. And from that, one of the main subjects is the study of cosmic ray showers hitting the Earth's atmosphere. Here you can see a movie where you could see the 6 stations of the SuperTERP illuminating by the radio waves. And I will play the movie again. What is interesting is to look at the time scale at the top right of the image. And you see the time scale is in nanoseconds, actually. And in tens of a few hundred nanoseconds, you can see the antennas illuminating, and this allows you to determine the direction of arrival, the energy, and there was some constraint, the depth of the shower, and some constraint of the cosmic ray composition. And there is a whole group working on this with LOFAR that had really nice results on this subject. Okay, now let me concentrate on the two main modes, the imaging and beamforming mode. First, the imaging mode of LOFAR. And so you make images by combining the signals from the whole LOFAR and doing correlations. So first, I stay in the heliosphere, close to the sun, and a result from our community, Julien Girard was a PhD student of mine, we made actually the lowest frequency image of Jupiter radiation belts. So this is the size of Jupiter. The image is with this color bar. So the flux go to a few Jansky, so it's kind of a strong source. But we could make a very nice image of these radiation belts. This is the beam shape. And if we compare this image, that is in dotted red here, with an image taken at the VLA at 5 gigahertz, so more than typically 30 times the frequency, the image of the VLA is the black contours. So first, one striking thing is that we have an image of almost comparable quality to the VLA, in spite of a factor 30 in frequency. And the second thing is that the belts are more extended by 1 or 2 Jovian radii at low frequency. And this gives some information about the distribution of energetic electrons around Jupiter. And we made spectral measurements to combine with VLA measurements and other measurements here to have the spectrum towards the lower end of the spectrum. And we made some comparison of individual snapshot images with simulations by Onera of the radiation belts of Jupiter. And typically what has to be seen here is that the brightest point in the images correspond to the brightest point in the simulation at various phases of Jupiter. And there are more detailed work ongoing for that. Now, in our galaxy, we have very nice sources. This is one of the early images of LOFAR. This is the so-called SS433 microquasar here that is emitting jets and rotating, and it makes a diffuse envelope that has this kind of helical shape here, and that was imaged a few years ago. So the papers are recent, but people worked in the first time of LOFAR for several years on the data before getting out the images. When making images of nebula like the Cassiope A supernova remnant here, you have the shell around the former supernova. And in this shell, actually, through this shell, you can measure a spectra. In this spectra, you can identify very narrow absorption lines. And these are known since the 60s, actually. They are called recombination lines. It's atomic lines of the atoms at a very high excitation state. Here, the fundamental is the fundamental state is at the n equals 576. So the size, if you compute the size of the atom with the Bohr formula, for example, you have an atom that is 70 micron in size, actually. And because these places are very cold, very quiet, you can have these forbidden lines that exist and that allow to be measured, and with very high accuracy, you can measure the conditions, density, composition, temperature, and so on, in this environment that are crossed by the signal. The size of Cassiopeia is a few arc minutes. I cannot tell you exactly how many arc minutes, but a few arc minutes. Now, as I told you, there was a transient group in LOFAR, and the transient group developed a pipeline to make a kind of dictionary of images and difference between images taken at different times, and try to find sources that blink actually in different images, and look in this way, in a blind way, for any kind of transient, for identifying later what are these transients. And actually it was quite disappointing because just a few transients were discovered with LOFAR. This is the first one, and there are not many more. So you see here there is a transient that is here, that is not here. It's 3 images. It's at 60 megahertz, taken at different times. And this transient is not identified as far as I know. And there was a disappointing low number of blind detections for transients here. This may be due to the fact the LOFAR signal is processed, actually, the RFI mitigation, the way the correlation is done. For example, we have colleagues in Ukraine with a compact antenna array in Kharkov, in Ukraine, who seem to discover a quite large number, hundreds of transients in the 10 to 30 megahertz range, because it's a compact array that does not go through correlation and imaging, and it may be a reason. But there was some prospect from the... At high frequency, in gigahertz or so, blind transient are found by tens or hundreds, but not more. And so thousands were expected or more in LOFAR. It's not the case. So this is the thing. So now I will come back to the survey, but this is an early survey results. Surveys started to make deep images of the sky, and of course the main studies are galactic and extragalactic objects. And this is the so-called Boötes field in the Boötes constellation at 150 megahertz with a good sensitivity, so a tenth of a milligensky, so 120 microgensky here, with a resolution of few arc seconds. And the source counts reveal many, many unknown sources. And because LOFAR has a broad field, at this frequency, 150 megahertz, the field is almost 3 degrees, so it's very broad. And so you can have a kind of compendium of galaxies with jets, AGN, detected in single fields, actually. Now, there are detailed studies of radio source. So this is extremely far from my competence, so I just read what is in this. So-called relics due to shocks, so allowed to study shocks in galaxy clusters, precisely, and the morphology of so spatially resolved studies of galaxy and AGN below 100 megahertz, so at the lowest ever frequencies here, with high resolution, thanks to the international baselines here. Here, jets from a galaxy. In this field, several thousands, but I will, in 1 minute, tell you about the results of the first survey, and there are numbers in this. I don't know exactly in this field, I think it's a few thousand, but I will give you a number later. So there is still a key scientific project that is Epoch of Ionization. So again, I'm not specialist of that. I think there are more specialists in this room than me. But typically, among the decisive time in the universe, there is, of course, for each of us, our birth, but this is very local. But there is the CMB emission at typically 380, 400,000 years. And then there is a very dark period because CMB emission, cosmic microwave background, is the last recombination. So now most of the matter is neutral. And so nothing really happens of very exceptional before the first stars and galaxies start to form. And they start with the light they emit to re-ionize the intergalactic medium that is ionized now, because if it was not, we could not observe the H1 line from distant galaxies. And so reionization is set at a few 100 million years after the t equals 0, after the Big Bang. It's the same. And so the idea is to find, so it corresponds to a z that is between, I think, 6 and 12. So typically, z equals 10 corresponds from the H1 line at 1.4 gigahertz to an emission shifted at 140 megahertz. So in the middle, so you know that, of course, everybody, that we shift the emission by the Doppler, cosmological Doppler effect. So the emission is expected to be around 150 megahertz. And so what people expect to see is the negative, actually, of the image. So seeing the remaining region of neutral hydrogen at the time of ionization, and through history, so with the frequency, seeing how the bubbles start to be ionized and how the neutral hydrogen disappears. And of course, it is extremely difficult to do that, because to do that, you have to remove all the existing sources between you and the plane that emitted the radiation. So all the galaxies, all the sources that are called foregrounds. And this is extremely difficult, and the way to proceed is actually to observe these foregrounds, to identify them, see their spectrum, that is in general smooth, and so subtract these sources with their spectrum from the data in order to get the residual image that would be the image of the original fluctuation of the ionization. And actually, LOFAR does not expect to really make an image of the ionization. This will be the goal of SKA. They expect to detect it statistically in the residuals. And as far as I know, they made a huge effort in imaging and radio source detection. For example, this is a deep image of, so the fields that were selected are fields that are not polluted by our galaxy, so near the north celestial pole. So typically field there. So a few fields, the NCP field was the most studied. So there were thousands of hours allocated. Many is analyzed. The sensitivity, this was 1 or 2 years ago, so it must be better now. They are at a few tens of microjansky, so very, very deep sensitivity in these small fields because of the many hours of observations. So with very nice images, when you try to emphasize the dynamic range, the contrast between, in the station beam, between the faintest and stronger source may reach 1 million, and all this source must be subtracted down to the faintest one. And then there is a map obtained at this angular scale in which the signal is statistically searched, and it has not been found yet. There are limits that are decreasing, but it hasn't been found. Now, as a precursor of the survey of LOFAR, there is also a shallow survey of the whole sky, the whole northern sky, that is called that was called at the beginning Million Shallow Source Survey, and that was renamed Multi-Frequency Snapshot Sky Survey. So it's shallow because it's just 15 minutes of integration, and typically it's a map of all strong, let's say strong, more than 10 millijansky, typically radio sources in the sky that allow to be the global sky model that is used to make deeper imaging with LOFAR. And while doing this catalog, there were some surprises, like giant radio galaxy found. This is a cluster of galaxies in optical. This is the radio emission that extends over very large distances, as large as the full moon in the sky. And there were some other giant radio galaxies of more than 1 megaparsec across, observed in the course of this survey. Now, imaging was, of course, one of the main goals of LOFAR, and so a lot of effort was dedicated to improve the mathematical imaging tools. And this was done everywhere in the world, but especially in France, where we have a few very, very clever people, I mean very experienced people. Cyril Tass is one of them. There was work done in Nice, in Saclay. Cyril Tass in JP in Meudon developed the first one of the first imagers for LOFAR that was used in the first time. So the idea is, since 1996, the problem of interferometric imaging was put in a very elegant mathematical way, in a matricial formalism, where you relate the observable, that are the visibilities, the cross-correlation between the antennas, to the sky by the intermediate on each side of the instrument and propagation contribution toward each of the two antennas of the baseline. And actually, the problem is to invert this equation in order to retrieve the sky. And there are some kind of nonlinear methods to do that were developed. And one very recent 2016 to 2017 method was a mathematical method to decompose actually this matricial relationship in order to diagonalize or pseudo-diagonalize the matrice. It's called the Wirtinger imaging. It was done mostly by Cyril Tass in France and Oleg Smirnov in South Africa, working together. There was other works doing recently in thesis, and this allowed extremely large increase in the quality of the images and in the speed of processing. So what was developed in JP, so by Tass and Smirnov and Tass, was a software called DD-Facet, so direction-dependent faceting image. So you divide the sky in facets, and you solve for the instrument response, not globally for the whole sky, but in every facet. So you will take into account the different ionosphere in each facet. You will take into account the different beam of the instrument in each facet, and this greatly improves the imaging results. So these are kind of characteristic of this software that was developed here. And one of its characteristics, besides the quality of the images, is that it is very fast. It is at least 10 times faster than previously existing imaging software for LOFAR. And this is crucial because when you go to SKA, for example, the speed of the processing will be absolutely instrumental, or else you cannot process the flow of data. So this was the best image, a deep image done before DD-Facet. So you had some kind of large artifact around the source. It's a good image because you go deep in sensitivity, but you have a lot of artifacts because the calibration was done once for all for the whole field. And with DD-Facet, the same image is this. And so the increase in quality is very striking. And all these small things here are galaxies with jets, AGN or stuff. So there is a whole new world that just appears in your telescope. And for example, and DD-Facet is very flexible, so it's used on several telescopes, and it was used for doing the first image of MERCAT 2 years ago, actually. MERCAT, the South African SKA mid precursor. So with this algorithm, the survey group of LOFAR, PI Huub Rottgering in Leiden, decided to use this algorithm DD-Facet in production to do now the analysis of the whole survey observation from LOFAR. And the survey observation intend in a few years to cover the whole northern sky, actually. And what is covered now is what is in red. Well, red, green, and yellow are successive steps of imaging. This blue rectangle is the so-called HEDDEX field, the Hobby Eberly Telescope dark energy experiment, so a deep optical search for dark energy that coincide with these observations. And these are the characteristics of the survey, so several hundred, actually more than 24,000 hours observations to cover the whole sky. Only part of it is done. 5 arcsecond resolution, 100 microdonsky or better sensitivity. This bandwidth at 150 megahertz. At present, 20% is done, and 50% will be done in the 2 coming years. And the data volume is huge, actually, petabytes, tens of petabytes of data. And this is, so it's called LOTS, LOFAR 2-meter sky survey, the fraction 1 of it. And the sensitivity versus frequency of LOTS is here compared to other instruments. And you can see that it's extremely sensitive, more than 1 to 2 orders of magnitude compared to GMRT, GLIM, etc., Westerbork, and so on. And the angular resolution is given by the size of the circle, and so it's just a few arcseconds for LOTS. And so with that, so this year, there was the first data release of LOTS, and this is the response to your question about the source count. So in this first data release, it covered this rectangle, the so-called HEDDEX field, that represents a little over 400 square degrees, down to 70 microjansky sensitivity. And in this field, there were a catalog of more than 325,000 sources found, and 73% have optical counterpart that have been searched automatically in catalogs from SDSS, catalog in radio, FIRST, NVSS, WISE, PANSTARS, and so on. So you have some examples of matching, and this first release reveals a zoo of complex radio sources. And actually, there will be a special issue of Astronomy and Astrophysics very early 2019. The papers are finalized now. There will be a bunch of more than 20 papers published at once in this special issue. So in order to compare what is obtained with this data release, this is the VLA at 1.4 gigahertz, so the first observation. So point sources, approximately 90 sources per square degree, with the VLA in extended configuration, so with arcsecond resolution. This is the VLA in compact configuration with several arcsecond resolution, and typically it's an NVSS survey at low frequency with typically 50 sources by square degree. And this is the same field from data release 1 from LOFAR. So you see the improvement in image quality, and there are 750 sources per square degree, so typically a factor of 10 over what was known before. And many of these sources have exquisite resolution. This is a very small fraction of a 20,000 by 20,000 image. It's M106. This is the optical image of the galaxy. And so there is, of course, a lot to do for, and this is typical shapes of galaxy, AGN jets that are found. This is a kind of AGN with jets that seems to spiral, and you see the jets interrupting and restarting like an helicoidal shape. So they are very nice work. So now I enter for a few slides to the domain in which I'm totally incompetent. So please interpolate in what I'm saying. So there was, from this data release 1, there was a lot of observation of galaxy clusters. Here you have comparison of LOFAR in red and X-rays in blue from Chandra here. And in these clusters, what is striking is that in spite of the scales, so hundreds of kiloparsec, megaparsec, you have kind of coherent structure, filaments that you can observe. And so obviously you have, these are the largest structures that are known in the universe. And you have acceleration of relativistic electrons that produce this radiation over scales of megaparsec that, according to the people here, translates the large-scale dynamics of the universe, so at the largest scales. This is the Abell cluster observed by LOFAR and by LOFAR compared to X-ray, XMM. And again, you see very fine jets. You see emission with shape of shocks that are called relics. You see halos. And all this tells you that the local universe at this large scale is not yet relaxed. It continues to merge, to interact. Source count were very useful because source count, this is increasing luminosity at 150 megahertz. When you go to lower luminosity, you combine this with as the Sloan Digital Sky Survey in optics. This allows you with spectral measurements to separate AGN from star-forming galaxies. And actually, for almost the first time, you start to observe a lot of star-forming galaxies at low luminosity, actually, that were not observed before. And this gives you access to many, many stellar formation galaxies and to counts of the local universe content that you can use to constrain the topology of the universe. Observation of AGN show you that this is the fraction of the time when the AGN is radio loud. I mean, people know that the AGN are sometimes loud, sometimes quiet. And the fraction of time during which it's loud increases with the increasing stellar mass, actually, of the galaxy, also increase with the black hole mass. And what you can see is that beyond a given stellar mass, the AGN is 100% of the time on, active. So what was found is that in massive galaxy, the AGN seems to be always on, and people think that it may prevent the gas to condensate, and it may explain the deficit of galaxies with a large stellar mass in the observations. So the detailed structure of typical radio source in gray from VLA at 1.4 gigahertz and in yellow contours from LOFAR at 150 megahertz, so 10 times less, you see the extension, the very large extension actually of the jet structure compared to the highest frequency. The core is here. And you can see that the jets interrupt, restart, so this can be sign of the duty cycle of the AGN, and some of them are just remnants due to the lifetime of the electrons, so-called relics. In the nearby galaxies, for the galaxies that are resolved by the observations, the radio emission gives you contour of synchrotron emission from high-energy electrons, typically cosmic ray electrons in galactic halos. And the measurement of this allows, with some assumptions from these people, to go to a constraint on the cosmic ray energy, the magnetic field of the galaxy that guide the motion of these electrons, and the galactic winds that actually redistribute these electrons here. And there are compared images that are done between LOFAR images of nearby galaxies and UV infrared images that give information about the stellar formation. And the comparison of the two gives you some constraint about the electron transport from the internal region to the halo and so on. Now, one very nice thing that you can do with polarized radio waves is study magnetism through the so-called Faraday effect. What is Faraday effect? Is the fact that when you have a linearly polarized wave that crosses a plasma with a magnetic field in it, the polarization plane of the wave rotates with the propagation, and it rotates differently at different frequency. So if you observe over a broad frequency range, you will observe the different rotation at each frequency, and it can allow you to retrieve the electron content, the magnetic field, along the path of the wave. And it actually, the angle of rotation is proportional to the square of the wavelength and the so-called rotation measure, that is the integral over the path of the wave, of the density and magnetic field of the intervening medium. And so in 2005, there was a paper by the late Herdebruyn and Michael Brentjens that introduced the so-called rotation measure synthesis. Because you observe at many frequencies, you can actually see which kind of rotation measure exists to some part of emission, because you will observe a consistent rotation of the rotation across the frequency. So you can do a kind of Fourier transform in lambda square of your signal, and it gives you actually the total content of the rotation measure along your line of sight. So it adds a third dimension to the image. It adds the depth to the image. You know that in a given image, for example, you have peaks in rotation measure at only 4 values, for example, and this tells you that among this radio source, you have 4 different distances with different intervening medium that give different rotation measures between the source and you. And this was applied to to interstellar medium observations, for example, by Jelic here. So the colors here is not the intensity of the wave, it's a diffuse emission, but it's a rotation measure. So it's a kind of depth of the emission compared to you. And so a very rich morphology was detected in this range with filamentary structures, regions very well delimited. And interesting thing is that it is the same image in color with different colors, and compared with the gray lines that are magnetic field measurements from Planck dust measurements. And you can see that the magnetic field clearly aligns with this yellow channel, for example. So these Faraday regions clearly are related to the galactic magnetic field. And you can, of course, do slices of imaging by selecting rotation measure slices. You can do images at different depths, actually, in the third dimension, at the distance from you, and you have here images at various depths from the observer. This was recently done at an extragalactic scale. This is a very large 3.5 megaparsec giant radio galaxy, in which linear polarization was found in the 2 lobes. And you can see from the color bar, the rotation measure is very different in the north lobe and in the south lobe. It has a difference of 2.5 radian per square meter, so which is very large. And so there are some good reasons to say that this difference in rotation measure is not creating in the lobe themselves, but it's in the intervening medium. So how can it be that you have so different values here? What is proposed in a paper here, soon submitted, is that actually you have a kind of giant plasma and magnetic field filaments at megaparsec scales that are actually intervening between the source. This is the source here. And so you have different intervening medium with these filaments that will provoke different rotation measures. And a statistical study of this could allow to map these filaments that I was said were suspected from SDSS, but I could not respond to this kind of point. So the data release 2 with a larger sample is on its way for lots. And also the second slice of observation with much deeper observation. That are the surveys that was released up to now was done with 8. Oh, it's okay. Sorry. Was done. It disappears. This was done with 8 hours. It's not written here. And this was data release 1 and tier 1 observation. Now we are going to observation of less fields, but for 10 times more duration. That gives you access to much fainter sources in some restricted fields. Okay, as time is passing, yes, I will go very, very fast now in the beamforming studies. So you're not doing images, you are combining mostly the core of LOFAR to do fine beams, and that you point toward unresolved sources. So a nice source is the sun. The sun is resolved, actually, but it's very difficult to image because it's very difficult to calibrate. And so one thing that was used is to make 100 beams on the sun and across, and in each beam to retain the full time and frequency resolution. And you can see actually the solar burst, and when the line goes across this, you have some part of the image, so you can see where the emission comes from, and at what frequency it derives. This was a very nice way of doing detailed studies of the sun. There were images also, and in the purely time frequency dimension, at the time scale of a few seconds, very, very fine structure were observed that correspond to electron beams moving in the solar magnetic field, and you can basically see indirectly these electron beams. So a big scientific goal of the beamformed observation is study of pulsars, and there is the LOTAS, LOFAR Tide Array All Sky Survey, that is the deepest low-frequency pulsar survey ever performed. So this is small images showing 2 pulses of each pulsar after folding and detection. So in last year, actually, there were about 50 pulsars discovered. There are above that now. I don't have the number right now. and it's probably a it will be a very successful pulsar survey. And some pulsars show a very strange behavior. For example, this was published in 2013. You have a pulsar that is alternatively bright in X-ray and radio, and it just oscillates. When it's bright in X-ray, it's dark in radio, and the opposite here was found. You had some observations of a blinking pulsar that is occulted by a secondary companion. So this is, I have no more, the laser seems to be dead. Okay. This is an occultation. It's a binary pulsar with a so-called low mass companion, so-called redback companion, that is irradiated by the pulsar, and at each rotation, there is an occultation of the pulsar here. And a very recent result, just last month, I think, is the discovery in one of the fields of LOTAS that was then imaged in the LOTS imaging survey of a pulsar with the longest ever rotation period, 23.5 seconds. So in the population of period versus derivative of period, this pulsar is here. So it's the longest period. And an interesting thing, when you measure the derivative, you can deduce the magnetic field, the age, and the energy rate. You can place it in this diagram. And these lines are theoretical, so-called death line of pulsars. So lines to the right of which you should not emit radio waves. So now the measurement become very constraining for these models. And more will be discovered soon, I guess. So going to planets, I told you that Jupiter is very, very intense in radio waves, especially up to 40 megahertz. This is an image from Cassini. And of course, we are wondering since a long time if we can detect exoplanets with LOFAR, exoplanet that could be emission like a magnetosphere like Jupiter, or hot Jupiters interacting very close to their star, interacting magnetically with the star. And there was theoretical predictions done, and for all known exoplanets, and when there was, so best guess frequency and flux density, and when compared to the LOFAR sensitivity, you expect to have a bunch, not thousands, but a bunch of known exoplanets above this line. And so a lot of effort was dedicated to that, and this is well observed in beamform mode. And so in order to go fast, because I'm late, we made a pipeline, actually. We derived with Jean-Mathias Grismeyer in Orléans and Jake Turner, an American PhD colleague. We made a full pipeline to analyze beamformed observation, and in order to benchmark it to know how sensitive we are, we tested it with Jupiter observation that we attenuated more and more, so 10 times, 100,000, 10,000 times, and so on. And so when we attenuate, for example, 10,000 times Jupiter, we have a signature in polarization that is very tiny, on and off, and you have a very clear detection in time series or in average spectra. This is on minus off. You have very clear detection of your signal. You can also look at burst by doing high-pass filtering, and you can detect burst also very easily. I don't go into detail, but you can detect long-term and fast-varying signals. And this is the next slide that I wish is not in the movie. So we could state that we can detect a signal that is typically larger than 10 to the 4 times Jupiter, up to 5 to 20 parsec range. It seems very, very large, but actually it seems to be possible from the theory. And last thing, and I'm sorry for being a little long, last thing, we realized that, okay, we make images for integrating the signal and look for hours or long observation. We make beamformed observation to look for short-term signals. And what if we could combine the two, actually? People doing transient just thought about doing difference in images. We thought about another way. Recently we observed a source, a stellar source, with an exoplanet around it, and the star was producing radio emission at a few gigahertz. So variable radio emission observed with the VLM. Okay? So we made observation with LOFAR. LOFAR in this field, after very deep processing, shows no emission in this frequency range. But then we found that it is possible from the images, after the cleaning and the calibration, to extract a posteriori the dynamic spectra of any point source in the field. And so we can do in software integral field dynamic spectroscopy, like when you put optical fiber to many, many stars at the focus of a telescope. Here we can do this in software, and our software selects which position. We have a virtual optical fiber, and we can make a dynamic spectrum here. And we thought that this was a cool way of looking for transients, and so we proposed this to the survey key project, who accepted. We made a catalog of 33,000 objects, all exoplanets, cool dwarfs, variable stars, and Gaia Data Release that is here. This is the Kepler field. And we are now applying this to every observed survey field, and we start to have accidental detection here in total intensity. So this is I, V, and the dynamic spectrum in total intensity, linear and circular polarization. And we start to dig into this, and we'll have this kind of dynamic spectra in all radio sources here. Okay, I skip the statistics for the publication. There are many, 200 total, and that's it. There are standard observations. The future of LOFAR, it's an instrument that, in spite of the advent of SCA, our Dutch colleagues want to push, and so there are some improvements in the software, in the hardware for computation, in the electronic of the station, maybe new antenna design that will be inspired from our design in France, more stations, dual beamforming, and all this is called LOFAR 2.0 project. And in Nancy, we decided, in addition to participating to LOFAR, to go from the Nancy LOFAR station to an instrument called Nénuphar, that is a very large array of antennas specifically dedicated to the very low frequencies, the lowest range of LOFAR. So you can imagine for exoplanet search, because we expect low frequency signal. So I skip the detail. This is an image of the field here. And the sensitivity will be better than LOFAR at low frequency, and will be mainly interested in the cosmic dawn signal before ionization and the exoplanet and stellar signals. And then to finish, because it's time, the further ups, and it did it to me already once or twice. Okay, I will just speak. The future is, of course, SKA. SKA will have its construction started very soon, and it should be operating in the mid-2020s. And SKA will have one half of the instrument in Australia looking at 50 to 350 megahertz range, and the other half in South Africa looking at the higher frequency range up to 15 or more gigahertz. And it will be a huge international instrument. And so the French community is now trying to organize, gather. We wrote a French SCA white book in order to be part of the project that is of the scale of being a TGIR, a very large research infrastructure that should be funded by the ministry. And so we are doing active scientific lobbying for making this happen. Thank you. Sorry for the time in excess.